Also jetzt sind wir live, wenn ihr das so über Facebook, Instagram oder was so teilen wollen. Eu acho que a maioria de vocês fala alemão, né? Eu tenho a impressão de que sim. Então, ja, also ich denke, das ist eigentlich kein Problem, dass wir auf Deutsch sprechen, weil die ganze Mehrheit hier Deutsch spricht. Interessanterweise. So fleißig sind die Brasilianos. Então, a gente está começando agora o terceiro Congresso Brasileiro Christian Wolff, que também é o 10º Simpósio do Núcleo de Filosofia Kantiana aqui da UEL. Wir fangen hiermit, also der dritte brasilianische Wolff-Kongress, beziehungsweise diese 10. Kant-Tagung, was wir hier in Londrina seit einem Jahrzehnten organisieren. Ja? Bom, essa é a terceira edição, né? Nós fizemos uma edição em 2024, wir haben einen ersten Kongress 2024 gemacht, das war im Mai und auch also so viele, die hier sind, waren auch da und das zweite Mal war letztes Jahr und ich denke Anfang des Jahres, da war auch so eine Mehrheit von den Leuten, die jetzt auch wieder mal vorträgt und dieses ist, ich denke so der Kongress, wo wir am meisten Leuten Präsenz hier haben. Also deswegen ist es schon was Besonderes in dem Sinne. Also es findet statt innerhalb eines Kooperationsprojekts, was wir mit der Universität Halle haben, mit meinem Doktorvater, Herr Heiner Klemme, als Projektleiter auf der Seite der Hallenser und dann auf unserer Seite, das ist von Herr Fabio Scherer geleitet, ne? Und das wird von Fundação Araucária finanziert, unsererseits, und DAAD finanziert auf der Seite, der deutschen Seite quasi. Ne? Jetzt also haben wir als Teil dieses Kooperationsprojekts diesen dritten brasilianischen Wolff-Kongress, so nennen wir es. Und ich denke, allmählich können wir schon Herr Walsh und Frau De Vita einladen, hier auf den Tisch zu setzen. Dann können wir, ja, wie gesagt, allmählich schon anfangen. Moment, ich lese mal vor die Titel. Ne? Moment, ist das? Willst du was vortragen? Doch. Ne? Was präsentieren mit dem PowerPoint. Ja. Kannst du mir bitte schicken? Also da kann ich hier.
Es ist aber.
Canva, oder? Ja. Okay, dann ja, einfach. Ja, ich verschieb's. John Walsh ist wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter an der Martin-Luther-Universität Halle-Wittenberg und er wird heute über Christian Wolff on Conscience vortragen. Então, o John, ele é professor assistente na Universidade de Halle-Wittenberg. Ele vai apresentar hoje texto sobre Christian Wolff e a consciência. Und Frau Valentina Dafne De Vita ist wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiterin bei Leucorea, oder? Auch an der MLU, und sie wird über Resistance and Good Government in Wolff's Political Theory vortragen. John wird das erstmal machen und dann Daphne ist dran. Moment, John? Tá ligado, Charlie? Tá ligado. Ja, klar. Mit oder ohne? Daphne, Wasser? Mit oder ohne? Limonada. Moment, warum funktioniert das? Do ar tá certo.
Acho que lá não tá.
Geht nicht? Oder? Não, já tá dando certo, eu acho.
Ligou? Foi.
Ich denke, du musst auch also diese Einstellungen auf, also damit die Bild einfach wieder spielt.
Ich habe geklickt, dass das Bild.
Nachdem du das zweite Mal das eingestellt hast?
Nein, aber das hat mich nicht
okay.
veranlasst.
Moment, ich ruf mal den.
Oder ich kann versuchen, Canva hier einzuladen.
Kann auch sein. Technische Probleme.
Ja. Ist das, du hast auch Canva.
Jetzt hier stehen wir sehen für das. Und eher weiteres Standfleisch, ne? O HDMI não está funcionando no computador do John. É, a gente tá tentando. Und klickst du es oder kann ich?
Ich würde das lieber machen.
Sven. Svens? Ist das hier? Nö, geht nicht. No YouTube tá indo, pessoal. Alguém consegue checar isso pra mim? Congresso Christian Wolff no YouTube.
Also, dann sind wir bereit.
Stimmt schon. Moment. Ja, die sehen ein bisschen übertragen. Foi? Okay. Ja, du bist dran.
Yeah, then many thanks to Fabio and Emmanuel and Charles for the organization and the opportunity to speak. This is still a work in progress, so I look forward to any comments and suggestions. So contemporary audiences are perhaps most familiar with Conscience through Disney's Jiminy Cricket, whom the Blue Fairy dubs Pinocchio's conscience, Lord High Keeper of the knowledge of right and wrong, counselor in moments of temptation, and guide along the straight and narrow path. Yet this characterization captures several features commonly associated with conscience throughout the early modern period. For example, conscience concerns moral cognition, practical deliberation, and guidance of one's conduct. Despite broad agreement on this general conception, early modern accounts of conscience varied widely on its nature and its role and agency. One such dispute concerned the nature of moral cognition itself. Is consciousness of divine law, or does it instead involve cognition of the law of nature independently of representation of God? A second concerned the authority of conscience and practical deliberation, whether an erring conscience nevertheless binds, and what role conscience plays in blame and imputation. A third dispute concerned conscience' practical efficacy, namely whether conscience is merely evaluative or can also guide and motivate action. These disputes admitted a variety of positions, but together they define some of the central questions that structured early modern accounts of conscience. Although this connection may not be immediately apparent to modern readers, these disputes collectively bear on the nature of practical reason. Medieval and early modern discussions of conscience were not simply concerned with an isolated moral faculty, but with the cognitive processes by which agents judge, deliberate about, and regulate their actions. The question of conscience, then, is about the role it plays in rational agency generally. So our primary aim in this paper is to show that Christian Wolff's account of conscience constitutes a distinctly modern conception of practical reason. Although much could be said about what it means for a conception of practical reason to be modern, one hallmark of such a conception is that it circumscribes a normative space in which objective reasons can become practically efficacious for rational agents independently of the representation of God. We argue that Wolff's account of conscience articulates precisely such a normative space by explaining how objective reasons become efficacious through moral judgment, practical deliberation, and the guidance of action. And part of the background for the project kind of builds on claims by Anscombe and Darwell. So Anscombe claims that modern moral philosophy is characterized by its kind of juridical underpinnings and concepts like law and duty and imputation. And Darwell claims that Grotius represents the beginning of modern moral philosophy, and so far as duties are not just teleologically conceived in a kind of Aristotelian framework, or nor are they based on needs or desires in figures like Hobbes, but you have duties that are grounded in a law of nature. And so we don't mean to contradict this view, but to focus on a related or perhaps complementary issue, namely how objective reasons become practical. So this sense of practical reason, this kind of normative space in which objective practical reasons can be efficacious. So this involves kind of these three aspects that I've glossed kind of along the lines of Pinocchio and how conscience is represented there. Namely, that it involves kind of a moral cognition, that it involves practical deliberation, and that it involves efficacy or motivation. So these are kind of the three aspects of practical reason that we have in view. And it's along these lines then that we argue that Wolff's account of conscience can be seen as a modern conception of practical reason. So we'll start off in section 2 and argue that the judgments of conscience are inferentially structured. In 3, we argue that conscience as moral judgment applies objective principles to particular actions. And in 4, we reconstruct this deliberative role of conscience. In section 5, we consider the role of conscience in guiding action and argue that it explains how objective normative reasons come to motivate rational agents. And although Wolff never uses the term practical reason, we argue in 6 that his account of conscience is best understood as a theory of practical reason. In 7, then I would just conclude. I think for the sake of time, I'll probably focus mainly on the first 4 sections and then give a brief overview of what I'd like to accomplish in sections 5 and 6. All right, so conscience as discursive judgment. Wolff defines conscience as the judgment about whether our actions are good or evil. Yet judgment admits of different forms for Wolff. He distinguishes judgments that immediately predicate something of a perceived object from those elicited through inference. Against this background, we argue that judgments of conscience are inferentially structured, or what he calls discursive. Establishing this inferential structure is a first step toward showing the centrality of conscience to Wolff's conception of rational agency. Wolff understands judging in terms of predication. So he says, quote, "When we judge, we connect or disconnect at least 2 concepts with each other, namely the concept of the thing of which we judge and the concept of what should be ascribed to or denied of it. For example, we judge of a building when we say, this building is nice. And so then niceness is predicated of the building. As Wolff elaborates, as soon as we distinguish the kinds of things in their genera, as well as their attributes and alterations and their relations to each other, we cognize that this or that thing has, or at least could have, this or that in itself, or also that something could arise from it. That is, that one could find in it the ground of an alteration in something else. And this exercise of the understanding is called judging. Judging then consists in distinguishing a represented object and predicating something of it. This operation, in turn, admits of 2 forms. All our judgments, he says, are either intuitive or discursive. So with this, all judgments are intuitive or discursive, and we're going to argue that the judgments of conscience are always discursive. In intuitive judgment, we attribute to a certain being what we regard to be contained in its concept, whereas discursive judgment is elicited through reasoning. Wolff's account of intuitive judgment therefore turns on his broad conception of concept. A concept is any representation of a thing in our thoughts, where thoughts are understood as, quote, that effect of the soul through which we are conscious. Because a concept can be any conscious representation of a thing, complex particulars can be represented by singular concepts. Although a singular concept may represent a complex particular with multiple attributes and accidents, it does not thereby predicate any of them of the object. A perceptual tokening, considered merely as a representation, does not yet constitute intuitive judgment. To see this, consider Wolff's example of perceiving glowing iron. So he says, if I represent glowing iron, then I have a concept of the iron as well as of its being aglow, and represent both together and one within the other. However, in doing so, I do not yet judge anything of the iron, but rather I have a mere concept of the glowing iron. Right? So Wolff has a kind of peculiar view here of concepts. And so for him, just the perception of the glowing iron can itself just be one concept, like glowing iron as a singular concept. Only by the mental act of predicating something of the object does the judgment occur. So he says, as soon as I represent being aglow as something distinct from the iron and consider that it is now connected with the iron, I judge of the iron that it is glowing. And so if I merely perceive the glowing iron, I may have a representation of the glowing iron, but it's not yet a judgment until I kind of mentally dissect what's in front of me and predicate glowing of iron. In fact, this holds not only for complex particulars, but also for representations of multiple objects. Consider Wolff's example of two pieces of iron. He says, quote, the same applies if we simultaneously represent a glowing piece of iron and another that is not glowing. For as long as it remains a mere representation, then there is not yet any judgment. However, as soon as we notice the difference between the glowing iron and the iron that is not glowing, and attend to the fact that glowing is not connected with the one, we begin to judge of the iron that it is not glowing. So here Wolff refers to a representation that contains multiple objects, but it still remains a singular, undifferentiated representation. Judgment occurs only when an object is differentiated within the representation and something is predicated of it. Intuitive judgment, then, consists in predicating something of a perceived object. Discursive judgment, by contrast, arises from syllogistic reasoning. Consider again Wolff's preferred example of glowing iron. He says, if from the intuitive judgment, this iron is glowing, and from another judgment, prompted by memory, glowing iron burns, we elicit a third judgment, this iron burns. This third judgment is discursive, or Dianetic. Thus, in discursive judgment, we predicate something of an object through inference. And so with this background in place, then, we'll argue that the judgments of conscience are discursive. Wolff explains that, quote, whether actions are good or evil is judged on the basis of what alterations they bring about in our internal and external states, or in the internal and external states of human beings, of other human beings. Here he appeals to the metaphysical basis of an action's moral value in the nature of things. He says, quote, what results from human actions and makes them either good or evil originates from the essence of things and from nature. The nature of things and our own nature is such that actions entail certain alterations in our state. The judgment of an action's moral value is determined by whether these alterations promote or hinder perfection. This judgment presupposes insight into the nexus of things in which the entailment relations between things, actions, and human states obtain. The judgment of conscience, then, he says, requires insight into the connection of truths, which Wolff identifies with the faculty of reason. Hence, Wolff concludes, conscience stems from reason. And reason, in turn, is correlated with deductive inference, which Wolff dubs demonstration. So the inferential structure of judgments of conscience is manifest in Wolff's discussion of maxims. Judging the moral value of an action always requires a maxim or a general rule under which the action is subsumed. Wolff explains the process as follows, and here in the German Ethics in paragraph 190, he refers to paragraph 337 in the German Metaphysics. He says, this thing, namely the one that appears before us, is of such a kind. It occurs to us, all things of that kind are so constituted, and hence we judge this thing must also be so constituted. And so applying this to a maxim or, a judgment of conscience, we might have the maxim, for example, that all murder is evil, which would function as the major premise of the syllogism, under which the intuitive judgment that this action here is murder would function as the minor premise, and then the judgment, this murder is evil, which is a judgment of conscience, would be the conclusion. And so it's clear, I think, that the judgments of conscience are all discursive, they're all inferential. We don't ever have a simple intuitive judgment of an action that this action is good. Instead, we invoke the concept of the action and kind of a battery of inferences based on actions and whether or not they promote perfection and therefore whether or not they're good or evil. So part of the point in making this claim is that in the first chapter of the German Ethics, Wolff is a little bit ambiguous about what it means to have what he calls Erkenntnis des Guten. He talks a lot about cognition of the good in that chapter, but it's not clear in what exactly this cognition of the good consists. And so I read the chapter on conscience to be kind of making good on this ambiguity left in chapter 1, that conscience is responsible for the judgments of actions on whether or not they're good or evil. And so the kind of cognition of the good that Wolff talks about before is ultimately something that is performed by conscience. And those judgments are always going to be inferential, which, because Wolff correlates kind of deduction and inference with the faculty of reason, it follows that conscience should be understood as deeply connected to reason, or even a manifestation of reason. Okay, so much for that section. Now I'd like to turn to conscience as moral judgment. So as the judgment about whether our actions are good or evil, the judgment of conscience is moral in the obvious sense that it predicates moral value. But in this section, we argue that conscience should further be understood as moral judgment in the sense of applying objective practical principles to particular actions. Accordingly, conscience occupies a role traditionally ascribed to practical reason. We saw above that for Wolff, what makes an action good or evil is the objective properties of things and their interconnection. Right? Like Wolff has this view that the nexus of things is such that certain actions have consequences that will entail certain alterations in our internal and external state. And it's precisely the perfection promoting or hindering character of these alterations that makes an action good or evil. And so an action being good or evil has an objective basis in Wolff's metaphysics and the nature of things and their interconnection. The same objective perfection promoting properties that make an action obligatory. Since good actions perfect our internal and external state, nature thus obligates us to do that which makes us in our internal state, or what is the same, our internal and external state, more perfect. And so here, there's just an extra step where Wolff ties obligation to what promotes perfection, which is synonymous with what is good. So obligation also has this objective basis in the nature of things and their interconnection. Goodness and obligation thus have the same objective ground. An action is good insofar as it promotes perfection, and it is precisely in virtue of this perfection-promoting character that we are obligated to perform it. Wolff's distinction between instructive and impelling conscience reflects these two ways in which the same objective practical determination enters into moral judgment. So he says, quote, when we judge of an action before it is performed or omitted, we either judge merely whether it is good or evil, or we judge whether we ought to perform it or omit it. In the first case, I call conscience an instructive conscience, but in the other case, an impelling conscience. Namely, in the first case, conscience merely informs us of the constitution of the actions. In the other case, it simultaneously impels us either to undertake the action or to omit it. And so the judgment that this action is good, and which would be instructive conscience or ein belehrendes Gewissen, and that one ought to perform this action, which would be the antreibendes Gewissen, therefore formulate the same objective practical determination just in different terms. The one is axiological and the other is deontic. There's simply two formulas for really expressing kind of the same like practical objective content, we might say. Both forms of judgment are objective as they are grounded in the nature of things and their interconnection. And both are practical insofar as they normatively determine action. The former determines an action with respect to its moral value, the latter with respect to whether it ought to be performed or omitted. Okay, so that's all for this section, is basically then to argue that conscience is not just inferential, it's also the application of objective practical principles to particular cases. All right, so now we'll turn to conscience and practical deliberation, as well as the role that it plays in blame and exculpation. So here we focus on the evaluative function of the instructive conscience in practical deliberation and show how it figures in judgments of blame and exculpation. In the next section, then, we'll look at the guiding function of impelling conscience with respect to motivation. A central distinction here is that between antecedent conscience and consequent conscience. The former indicates the judgment about an action's goodness before it is undertaken, and the latter indicates the judgment about an action's goodness after it has been performed. Consequent conscience can only be instructive. A judgment about an action already performed cannot impel the agent to perform it because the action is already in the past. And so the antecedent conscience is always the belehrendes Gewissen, or the instructive conscience. Antecedent conscience can be both instructive and impelling. And in this section, we want to focus on the antecedent instructive conscience. So the antecedent conscience where it's not yet telling us that we should do this, but it's merely making an axiological judgment that this action phi is evil or this action is good. The judgment about an action's moral value plays a straightforward role in practical deliberation. Considering the goodness of various actions is necessary to representing one as the best. However, this function also plays a more nuanced role in Wolff's account of practical reasoning, namely weighing the circumstances and relevant factors surrounding an action. This role is exemplified through the distinction between considered and unconsidered conscience. And sorry, this is in German. Wenn man in besonderen Fällen ein Urteil fällt, so werden entweder alle besondere Umstände erwogen oder einige übersehen. Im ersten Fall nenne ich das Gewissen wichtig, im anderen aber unwichtig. So this distinction between wichtiges and unwichtiges Gewissen is not between important and unimportant conscience. Wichtig here has kind of a more archaic meaning that's connected with erwogen. So it means more something like weighing the relevant factors, or it's like one that is duly considered, like a somewhat maybe less etymologically tight, but maybe more readable or intelligible translation might be considered and unconsidered conscience. The wichtiges Gewissen considers all the relevant factors and it has weighed them accordingly, where the unwichtiges Gewissen does not. And so Wolff gives an example of going to church. He says, this action is, in the abstract, he says, one can judge, I ought to go to church on Sundays. This action is going to church on Sunday, therefore I ought to do this action. This example that he gives is of the unwichtiges Gewissen. It's simply of the action type of going to church. But in kind of the immediacy of a practical context, there's all kinds of other factors that might come into play. And so he says, for example, if it is very cold on Sunday, the church service lasts a long time, and one is prone to illness, he judges in view of these circumstances that he ought not to go to church this Sunday. And so this would be a result of the wichtiges Gewissen. So you've taken all of the relevant factors into account. And so some of this material I've actually already published in another paper, but I'm going to rehash it here in this paper as well because it's relevant. And the other paper was about obligations and the obligation that we have. And here it's about our reasoning and cognition of or judgment about the obligations that we have. And this reveals a structure of Wolff's conception of practical reason that is not only modern in the sense of involving a secularized normative space in which objective reasons can become practically efficacious, but it is also contemporary in the sense of being non-monotonic. And so in monotonic reasoning, if you have a valid inference, you can add premises that won't invalidate the inference. So if I have if P then Q, and that's a valid inference, if I add if P and R then Q, then the addition of R does not invalidate the inference. But in non-monotonic reasoning, the addition or subtraction of premises does invalidate it. And that's exactly what we have here in Wolff, where you have a valid inference that's based on the unwichtiges Gewissen. I ought to go to church on Sundays. This action is going to church on Sunday, therefore I ought to do this action. I add additional, what would be called diffusers in non-monotonic logics or inference, such as I'm sick, the church is really far away, I didn't get any sleep last night, and all of these additional factors can undermine the validity of the inference. And so this non-monotonicity of practical reasoning is something that is discussed in contemporary contexts of ethics, and I think it's an original, and it's a very surprising and kind of important and interesting aspect of Wolff's account. All right, so we talked about then kind of this role in deliberation, and part of what's very interesting about Wolff's account is that this deliberation or the practical reasoning involved in it can be non-monotonic. So now I want to turn to this other aspect of deliberation in this section, namely kind of judgments of imputation and blame and exculpation. So a core aspect of practical reasoning is that you regard yourself as the author of your action, and that includes certain judgments like blame or exculpation, or that you declare yourself innocent or free or of guilt for certain actions. And Wolff's account of conscience then kind of fits this aspect of practical reasoning as well. For Wolff, fault, qua error, can be traced to a defective judgment concerning either the major or minor premise of a practical syllogism. Consider the practical syllogism for the judgment that a given action is evil, which has the following form. If an action A is F, then A is evil. This A is F, therefore this A is evil. If the agent misjudges the major premise, then the agent lacks or is mistaken about the general rule or principle, as Wolff puts it, in the guise of a conditional that the agent could apply to the particular action in question as a token of the action type specified in the rule. Wolff offers the following example to illustrate this case. An apprentice puts 12 bars of silver on the end of a table that has only 1 foot, which causes the table to topple and break. Here, the apprentice fails to recognize the general rule that if one puts too much weight on a one-legged table, then it will break. So here, the fault is due to like a misjudgment of the major premise. If the agent misjudges the minor premise, though, then he lacks a sufficiently determinate notion of the particular action to be subsumed under the general rule of the major premise, and thereby fails to recognize that the action is a token of the action type indicated by the major premise. Wolff provides an interesting example to show this. Suppose an agent, ignorant of the fact that the window of his hotel room opens up to a busy street, pours out his chamber pot, staining the coat of a passerby with its contents. Here, the agent knows that as a general rule, flinging human waste on the coats of passersby is bad. However, he lacks a determinate understanding of the action he performs, such that he does not judge that this instance of emptying his chamber pot could disturb morning commuters, since he fails to notice that the window opens up to a busy street. Thus, the agent misjudges that his action falls under the rule. So we have two basic cases where you can have fault, and both depend on this kind of inferential structure of judgments of conscience. One where you misjudge the major premise, and one where you misjudge the minor premise. So Wolff basically then argues that you can exculpate someone for these kinds of mistakes or these kinds of faults based on distinctions that he makes between what he calls what we already drew on, the antecedent and the consequent conscience, and also what he calls correct and incorrect conscience, and whether or not the fault was avoidable. And whether or not it is in fact avoidable for Wolff is a bit ambiguous. He thinks sometimes it can be difficult to judge whether it was truly avoidable, but he thinks there are certainly cases where it is clear. So it's not always easy to make the judgment, but there are some cases where you can definitely judge this was definitely avoidable. And if it was in fact avoidable, then you are exculpated. So as just maybe to give in the last few minutes, just a brief take on section 5, for example. This will then concern kind of motivation or guidance in the guise of motivation. And there's some passages in the chapter on conscience in the German ethics where Wolff talks about pleasure and displeasure. And he says then that this functions to obligate the agent further or in addition to natural obligation by the law of nature. And he therefore then argues that the law of nature should be understood as the law of conscience. And it's not exactly clear that Wolff holds this view, but I think there's good reasons to read him this way. And there's a paper by Seth Eggers that argues that Wolff takes pleasure and displeasure to be a necessary part of moral motivation. And so we have then objective obligations that are grounded in the nature of things and their interconnection. And the idea here is that in conscience, we judge whether an action is good or evil. And in so doing, pleasure or displeasure arise in connection with the judgment. And the pleasure or displeasure that then arises plays a role in actually moving us to perform the action or not. And so conscience then plays an important role in the kind of motivational aspect of practical reasoning, insofar as it's through conscience that objective principles, kind of the rules that are grounded in the nature of things, can be subjectively motivational for me. So one distinction you might draw on to cash this out is that objectively justifying reasons can be motivating reasons for an agent. So that's the plan for section 5, and in section 6 is partly to simply synthesize these three aspects of cognition, deliberation, and motivation, and to kind of give an overarching argument that conscience should be understood as practical reason for Wolff. We already saw a passage where Wolff says conscience stems from practical reason. Of course, before we get to the discussion, there's a very large and nuanced background of work on conscience and figures who discuss conscience in medieval philosophy, early modern philosophy. I didn't have time or space to discuss that here, but this will be part of the paper, perhaps mostly in footnotes, to kind of talk about how this differs or is similar to stuff that Aquinas does, or that Bale does, or Hobbes, or Butler. Yeah, that's the plan for the paper, and I thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion.
No, well, thank you very much, John. It was a great talk again. Now we go to Daphne's talk, and then we have 15 minutes debate for the questions and so on. So keep close your questions and stuff. Vuoi presentare del tuo computer, vero?
Ah, sì.
Sì, allora ecco, lo prendiamo e lo mettiamo. Dove?
No, questo è qua. Ok.
Vuoi inviare pure il mio quello di qua? Perché non so, c'è qualcosa che non va.
Ok, non lo so.
Come funziona solo quel video?
Oh! No, no.
No, mandamelo
Ok.
alla mail e poi metto.
Non ho internet.
No, ce l'hai al WhatsApp?
No.
Backup?
No.
Oh, aspetta.
Proprio possiamo anche fare così.
Aspetta. Flash drive. Non me l'hai inviato?
No.
Beh, cominciamo e
Sì.
parlo qualcosa.
Sì.
Ecco, dammi qua il...
Ok.
Sì, grazie.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. Eu sou muito obrigada com Emanuel e também com Fábio e Charles ter essa oportunidade. I am very happy to be here in Brazil for the second time, and I'm very happy to introduce this paper. So the theme is for me now not so new because I write my PhD thesis on the problem of resistance in Kant philosophy, but in those last 2 years, in the institutions and politics, I found really interesting what Christian Wolff writes about disobedience and resistance, and I think that it is really interesting to study these topics, to see the development of Christian's work, political thought. And yes, I have a presentation that you can see, but online it doesn't work. And,
Arriva.
Ok.
Puoi cominciare.
Ok. So, so I start. Okay. What is the link between the right of resistance and the description of ideal government? And how do authors of German natural law theory legitimate power before the French Revolution? My presentation today is to resist in the natural law theory of Christian Wolff. This paper represents just the first step of this study, and my plan for the future is to undertake a broader study that goes beyond Wolff. In my talk today, I want to analyze the development of Wolff's political thought. In this speech on the right of resistance, I also want to focus on the definition of the best form of government as expression of the connection between ethics and rights, and how through the 18th century, the consideration of resistance in natural law theory changes. Then the possibility to resist and to disobey give us a new understanding of political power and its legitimations, which is no longer justified by religion or God, and yet is still linked to the representation of a good life. Okay, I will need my PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah. Si può fare qua.
Ok.
Il tuo, dammi un po' più.
Sorry. Proiettiamo solo la cosa per la stanza, non fa niente se per internet non c'è. Se per te, però proprio bisogno.
Sì.
Ok. Ok.
Forse adesso
Fammi vedere.
no, che dovrebbe andare, ma agora eu acho que talvez seja isso. Windows P, né? Tá.
Ok. Ok. Sono sulla schermo? No. Okay. I'm going on. No problem. The case of Wolff is really interesting. Unlike Pufendorf, he does not define his right exclusively as a right to self-defense. Pufendorf formulates this right based on the duties to oneself of self-preservation. As I will show, Wolff's concept of self-preservation linked to disobedience and resistance seems richer because he also refers to the necessity of living in conformity with one's conscience as fundamental to spiritual self-preservation. It also seems that for Wolff there are reasons for resisting beyond individual self-preservation. People could depose the head of a state for reasons not immediately connected to the individual's moral self-preservation. Maybe I'm wrong in my evaluation of Wolff, and there are other natural law theorists who have a richer concept of resistance. For this reason, I'm very glad to be here and to have the chance to share the results of my research with you. To approach the right to resist, I think it's also crucial to consider how a good government should look for Wolff, and whatever it could be defined as an absolutist, as Grunert and Malek described him. Through defining an ideal government, and it seems we can better understand when and how it is necessary to resist, and of course, the right of resistance also gives a sketch of the relationships between rights and ethics, because it is ethics that imposes on us the duty to disobey or to resist constituted power when it is unjust. For this reason, my talk today will proceed as follows. First, I will sketch some elements of Wolff's public right, searching for the elements that constitute a good government. Then I will approach the case in which Wolff explains when disobedience, as well as the right to resist, as a right to oppose and destined monarch, are legitimate. I will refer to Deutsche Politik, so German politics, and Institutiones, because there are really relevant differences between both texts on those topics. Okay, wow. Okay, so I am going. As I said before, it is important to analyze how a political system should be before we define when resistance is legitimate. To wonder what a good government looks like means for Wolff to ask how much a government can deviate from natural law, and which type of government can best preserve and realize the perfection of community, as well as that of the individuals within it. On this point, Deutsche and Institutiones have some point of contact. In both texts, Wolff defines the Gemeinwesen, which is the translation of res publica, as being created through the will to live in peace and security and to promote the welfare of a community. But in Institutiones, Wolff stresses more the dependence and the origin of every form of government as a result of the will of the people. In Deutsche Politik, it seems that the will of population does not play a relevant role in creating a government. More important here are the virtues of the monarch or head of state. So I didn't know which translation fit better with the German word Oberherr, because sometimes I think that Wolff is thinking to König, but in other places it is more like a president or someone who is just making an administrative work of government. So in the German politik, Wolff distinguished really traditional between monarchy and tyranny, aristocracy and oligarchy, polity and democracy. Wolff uses the Aristotelian Polybian typologies of forms of government not so much to explain political development. He needs them just to distinguish a good government form from a bad one. As a general remark, we can say that Wolff, a government is good if it guarantees security and happiness, and if the head of or heads of state are virtuous and love their subjects. Here, yes, you can see. So in the German politik, we have a really traditional distinction between the different form of government, and I think also that here Wolff is really Aristotelian when he's talking about politik as a part of universal practical philosophy. Here, so in the German politik, Wolff affirms that the best form of government is monarchy because it's easier to have just one virtuous person, who is the head of state. In an aristocracy and in politeia, we need a sort of distribution of virtues among the different persons who are in power. Indeed, in monarchy, there are no parties fighting among themselves for their particular interests, while forgetting the real common good. If at first sight it seems that Wolff is here for an absolute monarchy, he also notes that it is good if the monarch listens to advice of councils. But of course, Heiner here is Wolff really the thinker of the dead air, the philosopher of the dead. But let's focus more on definition of tyranny and politeia. In Deutsche Politik, Wolff defines tyranny as the degeneration of monarchy. So as Wolff defines it, a tyrant is the head of government or a king who acts against the well-being and security of a state with intention. And the one who makes him of interest the sole purpose of this government. This definition is really interesting compared to the late definition of despotic monarchy, of institutiones. In Deutsche Politik, the link between respect for natural duties and practice of good government is very strong. This seems to also be the case of the definition of politeia, which Wolff also calls freie Republik, because here we have a minimum of limitation on freedom, since everyone is governing and nothing can be done without the consent of all inhabitants. For this reason, Wolff said that in the politeia you do not have abuses of power, as in the monarchy or aristocracy. But politeia is really hard to apply because of the lack of virtues of the majority of people. The lack of virtues could cause a more relevant problem than in the other two forms of government. Because of freedom in the politeia, decisions are taken slowly, and often there are modifications if someone becomes uncomfortable and not within the scope of the common good. For all these reasons, politeia is unable to guarantee stability. Too big an amount of freedom is, for Wolff, a synonym of instability. In the Deutsche Politik, Wolff expressed himself in strictly paternalistic terms. He expressly declares that the king should not conduct his subjects as a father would his children. Another important aspect, as I underlined before, is the connections within virtues and good government that seems to be weaker in institutions. Okay. Here, the contract, as well as the will and choice of population to have a determinate form of government, plays a more essential role than the moral character of the virtues or talents of the heads of government. Here, Wolff writes that in a state one should limit the freedom of individuals only if it is necessary for the well-being of the community. Another key point is that here Wolff specifies that the power of the head of state should always be limited by the constitution of fundamental laws. In addition, the monarch cannot impose some distinctions without consulting some functionary or the people directly. This is the case with changes to the constitution. The constitution was made by the folk, and for this reason, a monarch or should not be able to change it alone. Unlike in the Deutsche Politik, here Wolff claims that the power of a monarch is not unlimited. It is always restrained by the constitution. Particularly, it is in institutions that Wolff stops defining democracy as a degenerate form of politeia. Here he describes the democracy as the only place where the population of a state has civil freedom, in contrast to monarchy. In institutions, Wolff also defines despotic monarchy as not identical with tyranny. Despotic monarchy can be a legitimate form of government. He defines this as in the form of kingdom where the monarch has the same rights over her population as a master over her servants. This means, as he already said about tyrants, that the head of state, he acts and uses the inhabitants only as a means for her own ends. But otherwise, A despotically monarchical state always needs the legitimation of its subjects to be legal. Wolff does not explain why it is that not every despotic monarchy immediately a tyranny, but he underlines that a despotic monarch also has duties to perform, such as law. And maybe as another relevant distinction, he may think there to illuminate monarchy. So I mean, maybe a despotic monarchy is not immediately a tyranny, because if we think to Enlightenment and the time of Enlightenment, we had, I don't know, in Austria, Maria Theresa, that at the end was an absolute queen, but also an Enlightenment queen. And yes, I think that in Institutiones is the work of that demonstrates that Wolff in 1750 is no longer for an absolute monarchy. He defines republics as a mixed form of government, and for this reason, they are the best form of government for Wolff. This is because in republics we have a limitation of power through the division of powers. He defines such republics as gesetzmäßiges Reich, lawful realms, where the power of the monarch is limited by constitution. When Wolff in Institution is talking about republics, he has in mind a constitutional monarchy. This element seems to be in contrast to Pufendorf, who say in the Repubblica Irregolare that mixed forms of government are weaker than simply democracy, monarchy, and aristocracy. Republics are therefore more unstable. Another important difference between Pufendorf and Wolff lies in the different ways in which government forms are legitimated. For Pufendorf, despite the negative sides of every form of government, all governments are legitimate because they are products of God. Wolff, by contrast, has a show that includes the will of the inhabitants of a state in the legitimation of a government. Moreover, he links more strongly than Pufendorf natural and civil law. Let's add another difference between Deutsche Politik and Institutiones. Wolff stressed in the Deutsche Politik that the monarch is like a father who plays the role of a guide for his subjects. Actually, Wolff still said that Institutiones, government should also provide for the perfection of all inhabitants with the aim of increasing the perfection of the state. He seems to abandon this paternalist view of political power. Indeed, here Wolff defines only the despotic monarchy as the place where we have a bigger asymmetry between monarch and inhabitants. Okay. Okay, perfect. The difference between Deutsche Politik and Institutiones are relevant, in my view, also in defining when one should resist the monarch. It seems that Wolff in Deutsche Politik focused more on the respect for natural law and the role of individual self-preservation. By contrast, in Institutiones, the self-preservation of community has a stronger role. Wolff also explained the Deutsche Ethik when and why I may disobey a direct command of the monarch. Yet in Institutiones, he explains when I should resist and as such when I should impede a monarch from acting or governing. Before approaching the right to resist, we need to take into account the difference between civil law and natural law, and how the former can derive from the latter. Wolff approaches this topic in a chapter of the Deutsche Politik on civil law. Here Wolff explains that natural law is the only law that humans need to follow, but to know this law one needs reason. Since not everyone is good, we need, in addition, bürgerliche Gesetze, that is civil laws to realize natural laws. This point is crucial in distinguishing ethics as a matter of natural law, which I can only know through my reason, and right. Since every human can approach natural law at a different level, and because not everyone is good or intelligent in the same way or the same degree, we did bürgerliche Gesetze to avoid misunderstandings and fights over what is right and what is wrong. If sometimes the civil laws do not follow the natural ones, it is because of circumstance, but this abweichung, so deviation, is always guided for Wolff by reason, and within the scope of the self-preservation of the community. Disobedience could also be justified if the civil laws deviate too strongly from the natural ones, or if a monarch acts against the letter. We have two big quotations. Okay. Wolff speaks about this case and points out that no one can command someone else to act against the natural laws. Here he explained that if a civil law deviates from the natural one, this could only happen because of permission. Verstattet is the word in German. But laws that are completely against the natural laws are unjust. In those cases, according to Wolff, it is important to challenge them and speak in favor of natural law, although it seems that not every citizen has the right to express her disappointment. Wolff speaks here only of people, I quote, welche nach dem Gesetzen Recht sprechen müssen. But the reality of civil law, which derivates from the natural one, is not enough to justify resistance. This because sometimes, in the interest of community, it is necessary to deviate from the natural law. However, there are cases in which one should be justified in disobeying the monarch, and these are, for the first, when the head of a government commands something against one's conscience. For example, if I were forced to convert to another religion, irreligion, here you can put, or if someone were to compel me to leave the country against my will. In such cases, I should not obey because in carrying out such an action, I would damage myself. Here, self-preservation plays a fundamental role. So for all this paragraph of German politics, self-preservation has a really important role. Because, and we can derive it from the use of the word Schaden, which constantly comes back. So if I'm not happy, I ruin, schade myself. But in that paragraph, self-preservation plays a central role. Through it, Wolff answered the question why one should obey civil laws, even if they deviate from the natural one. The example Wolff uses here relates to taxes, which a monarch imposes to pay for comedies and actors one may dislike. So for Wolff, we need to pay Rundfunkbeitrag or television taxes, because otherwise, with a punishment, we will damage ourselves. So we cannot agree with television, but we need to pay it. Although we may disagree with or dislike the right, we need to obey, and in this case, pay the taxes in order to avoid against Schaden. I think it's in the next one, yes. Ourselves. But we need to say here, but we need to disobey if the monarch tries to force us to do something really unjust. You have this in the last part of this quotation. Really unjust, like killing an innocent person. In those cases, we have to disobey because natural law is the same as the law of God. And so, like God, we cannot prevent someone from committing a crime but which should not commit it ourselves. It is interesting for Kantians to underline that here Wolff uses the expressions, and I am quoting in German, so muss man solche gestartet Gott mehr gehorchen als den Menschen, which means we need to obey God more than humans. So as a recapitulation of the main arguments of this paragraph, we can see, sorry, okay. Okay, noch weiter Entschuldigung. Okay. We should disobey if an action could damage our happiness. We should disobey if the action that a monarch commands is against the natural law. In this way, we can preserve our perfection, but otherwise we should obey in order to preserve ourselves. And this implies for the Wolff of Deutsche Politik that we cannot forbid the monarch from acting in a morally bad way. Like God, we need to avoid acting badly ourselves, but we cannot prevent that from happening. In institutions, self-preservation seems to acquire another meaning in the justification of resistance. As we saw in Deutsche Politik, Wolff speaks only of cases of disobedience, but he does not consider resistance. In institutions, he points out that I should not obey the monarch who is commanding something against natural law. So I should disobey, but I should also accept the punishment. But I'm justified to challenge and resistere, widersetzen. You can see here that he is using the word resistere. As to head of a state who does not respect or act according to the Constitution. As we can see, this is a very clear case of resistance and one that is not just determined by ethical issues. Besides this, however, Wolff remains very dogmatic in his sentences. Because, I mean, this is the sentence on resistance in Wolff. We do not have any explanation. For instance, when he later notes that an overhead could be removed, what does it imply that one should go against the head of state if she breaks the social contract and oversteps the limits of the Constitution? Wolff stresses, for example, that one can depose the monarch or government just because she does not act well, and what these expressions mean is also quite mysterious. Maybe a way to interpret this point is to recall the role of intentions. If a monarch or head of a government intentionally goes against the interest of state and the reason why it was created, that one should resist. Having recourse to constitution per passum remains a central point which refers not only to interests of individuals or the content of the law, but also to the form. It means that maybe one should resist if a monarch tries to establish a tyranny, acting in contrast to the Constitution. It is appropriate to recall here Heiner's late book on Selbsterhaltung der Vernunft, where he explains through the perspective of self-preservation in Kant's practical philosophy anthropology why we are morally obliged to resist an illegal government. Here, Heiner refers to Ernst Rudolf Huber, a student of Carl Schmitt, who declared that the Nazi revolution destroyed the parliamentary system. Heiner claimed focus on Huber's idea that the Führer should not be limited by the Constitution, because he is the head of the Drittes Reich. But the choice of an illegal system is the choice to overcome the civil state. So in Kant's word, it would be legitimate for one to resist. This reference, in my view, also aptly explains the right of resistance in Wolff's political thinking. Okay, yeah, now conclusion. Why are Deutsche Politik and Institutionen so different? Maybe the difference lies in their respective topics, namely politics and rights, in which politics is the reason for how things should be, whatever rights are about how things actually are. It is relevant here to underline that in Institutionen there is no longer a paternalistic concept of the head of state. Here we have a stronger influence, in my opinion, of Locke's two treatises of government, even if Wolff does not quote Locke directly. This is evident. In my opinion, Wolff's decry one should resist the Oberwehr when she acts against the Constitution. These elements underlines more the role of the social contract than deviation from natural law theory or the legitimation of a government. And here, disobedience is not grounded on a theological basis. So I have to resist even if the monarch breaks their contract with the inhabitants. For the Wolff of Deutsche Ethik, I cannot prevent someone like the monarch from committing a crime. In institutions, something changes because Wolff is no longer an absolutist, in my opinion. It implies that one has the right to stop the monarch if he acts against the Constitution. In this way, we can also explain why Wolff abandons a paternalistic conception of government and prefers mixed form of government, such as republics, which is, in the end, Wolff's description of a constitutional monarchy. For all this reason, I think that Wolff's political philosophy certainly deserves to be researched in greater depth. Thank you very much for the attention.
Want to start?
Thanks, Wolff. I have a question that engaged in the scope of your presentation. So John, I was convinced that your reconstruction of Wolff was consistent, especially as soon as we go into this effects that I know. It seemed though to give us clarity about Wolff, what the cost of making his account of conscience plausible. It struck me as I think that both of these, the term conscience, are very counterintuitive, or at least contrary to its common use. And that this is something that he himself was emphasizing when he said in that first section that probably identifies conscience as a judgment rather than sort of intuitive insight. And I was struck in Daphne's presentation, there is this passage from that section of the Deutsche Politik that we quoted, where Wolff says, in the context of being ordered to obey a false religion or to leave the state, right? He says, so wollen wir uns mehr schaden, wenn wir uns einem schweren Gewiss beständig tragen suchen.
Yes.
So that's something clear, right? So how does the notion of bad conscience fit into your concept, the reconstruction of the working John? I mean, so it just doesn't seem like it fits in the analysis. I mean, is it just odious stuff? But that doesn't seem to answer what Wolff was talking about here, would be playing for. So maybe you can elaborate on what that might mean, or if you're just making it popular usage of the term.
Sorry, so what specifically is it that doesn't seem to fit? So why can't we just say that bad conscience at bottom is erroneous judgment?
Right. Blaming ourselves, we're damaged to ourselves as a result of this, and that's what's to be identified with bad conscience. So it's not just getting it wrong, but kind of self-portrait. So I mean, is that isn't inconsistent in the fact really first again.
Yeah. So I think maybe this would be an aspect that would be consistent, but would need further elaboration. So like Wolff talks about in the chapter on conscience, about like the bite of conscience, and kind of goes into kind of the affective aspect of like how good conscience creates. I mean, this maybe fits with like the motivational aspect that I'll fill out in the future. That the good conscience causes pleasure, the bad conscience causes displeasure. I think it's part of that this kind of narrative of being tortured, or kind of the emotional, affective phenomenology of the bad conscience that perhaps fit in with that material.
Yeah, it comes on the back end of it, right? I mean, this is a way of plaguing ourselves after the fact.
Right.
So maybe there's more to say about that as well.
Mm. Yes.
Any more questions? Hatler?
That's a follow-up question to John. You argued that judgment on consciousness are discussed involved. Are there any interpretation argue that on?
No, so this isn't, that specific aspect isn't in direct intervention in the literature, but it just seems unclear, given some of Wolff's claims, especially that, given that we can have sensible representations of actions as good or bad, which may be based on Scheinbücher, but you might think, oh, well, I drink wine and I feel good, and I'm not basing this on a distinct representation of kind of the qualities of drinking wine and the consequences that come from it. I'm just basing my judgment on the sensible representation, or the Walsh of feeling the effects. And so you might think that this would be an intuitive judgment. But I think it would, for what would have to be always discursive, that maybe an intuitive judgment would be this wine is pleasurable, but then there would be like a further implicit premise that identifies the pleasurable with the good, and that the judgment that drinking wine is good would still be discursive. So again, it's not a direct intervention in the literature, but for one, there's also not much literature on it. So in 2018, Schweiger explicitly said in the Handbuch, Christian Wolff Handbuch, that there's almost no literature on the topic, even though it plays a central role in the universal practical philosophy. It's a whole chapter. And the only real work on it that I'm familiar with, which is a nice step, it's a very important contribution, would be that Heine Klemmer on Kant and Wolff on practice. But nevertheless, it struck me as important to just get clear on what conscience is. It's a judgment, we said that, but what kind? There's two kinds, and so which one is it? For those reasons, simply of clarity, I think it's important to argue which it is, and then it also fits kind of the thesis of the paper, that because it's discursive and Wolff correlates discursivity with reason, then there's good reason to kind of understand his account of conscience as kind of a broader account of practical.
André?
The presentation, I'd like to follow up with the discussion for John. So, difference between intuitive and present judgments. Yeah, so to form a present judgment, what you said, John, you have to treat their intuitive judgment as, for instance, learn and help. It looks like people are too spectrum. So, in the delicate chain, you have to have intuitive judgments, form the absence concept that can itself be resolved if absent concept. Like if you consider the theme as the subject, its determination of the predicate, we can gather its essentialia and form a distinct concept. And then make it as a principle and begin the chaining of syllogism. So I'm not sure how it does not belong to the senses, like the new concept of iron or
like you consider it as a determination, let's separate one from another. So I'd like to know, I don't know if it was clear what I just said, but how is the difference between something that the practical conscience, like there's a judgment, and a distinct concept we can perform by gathering implicit judgments about the essentiality of the object.
Thanks. So I'm not sure I understand the question fully. So I'll take a stab and you can tell me if it is in the right ballpark of what you're asking. I take the view to be something like duties, which I take to be rules about performing or omitting like action types. And then these can function as the major premise in inference. And then the minor premise would then be an intuitive judgment about a particular action that has either been performed just now or that I'm contemplating, and then you apply the major premise to the intuitive judgment and you have a judgment of conscience that like this action was good or evil.
Okay, about the left logic, the difference between the formation of implicit judgments, expressive judgments, and how the concept is to be used in the practical part of the left logic for changing, for beginning the changing utility.
Okay. And so what is the issue, or is it do you think it could contradict the view?
I was just like to think about it. So like this, in what sense is forming a distinct concept, not something to have that has to do with conscience? Because you can form them by getting intuitive judgments about essentiality of the things. So it also does not belong to the same, like the mere notion of the iron that's hot.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not sure, so I'll have to like, go back and look at those. I mean, also in the German logic, one talks about kind of the steps involved from like naming things and like getting concepts of things based on their Merkmale, and then we're moving from there to syllogisms. So I'll just have to thank you for the suggestion of looking to it.
Any more questions? Bruno?
Congratulations for both presentations. My question is for John. It would be correct to formulate the practical syllogism in Wolff in this way. We have first natural law in the mentioned premise. Second, we have the action must be subsumed in the middle premise. And in conclusion, we have the moral judgment concerning godless and madness of the action. It's a correct way of formulating the practical judgment.
That's a good question. I was thinking about this as well, and I'm a bit torn because the law of nature is formulated really as an imperative, or if we draw on this distinction between the instructive and the impelling conscience, it's kind of a deontic judgment. You ought to do this, or do that which promotes perfection, or that which perfects your internal and external state. And so it's not immediately clear that this would be the supreme principle of the instructive conscience. It doesn't seem like you necessarily need it. Wolff already identifies perfection with the good. And so it seems like you don't need the law of nature for the learning this. I'm not sure. I mean, that's kind of it seems like it should be, because it seems to be like the supreme moral principle, if you will. But on the other hand, because it's deontically formulated and it's kind of an imperative of how you should act, it's not immediately clear to me of why you would need it for the axiological judgments that this action is good, this action promotes perfection. I don't yet need the principle that tells me to act on those types of actions, or it doesn't. It's not clear to me that you do. So I'm a bit torn.
But it's not clear for me when it occurs. There, mistake in the moral judgment. It's a problem in recognizing natural law, or is a problem in relation to a formulation of moral judgment from natural law. Where is specifically the mistake in the moral judgment?
I mean, I think it can take different forms. I think usually it's just a form of either, in one case it can take different forms. So it could be that, the kind of the examples I gave of fault, it could be that you misjudge the major premise. It could be that you misjudge the minor premise. That there's an action and you mistakenly think it really is a case of doing charity, and it's actually a case of doing theft, or there could be something going wrong there. I think probably more common examples are have to do with the vestigism, simply not taking into account all of the relevant factors. And so you may be misguided into doing something because you've made a judgment just based on the unvestigism. You've simply kind of operated on rules governing action types without taking account of all of the relevant factors that are intervening on this particular moment. And I think for Wolff, this is something that is often going to cause an error in judgment. And sometimes it will then be excusable, and sometimes not. And he's also a realist in the sense that he doesn't expect anyone to have omniscience about this. And so he also talks about the probabilistic conscience, the Wahrscheinlichkeitstheorie. And so there's probably a story to be told as well, which I think needs to be incorporated in the paper about how that functions in exploitation, about how you have a conscience that kind of makes a probabilistic judgment based on all of the available evidence involved on the action type and all of the relevant circumstantial factors that are playing into it. And you take all of this into account and you do your best to judge whether the action is ultimately good or evil, if it's ultimately promoting or hindering infection. Thank you.
Any more questions? No? Well, then I think we can call it a day. No, not yet a day, but I mean, thank you very much, you both, for your very interesting presentations. Okay, now we'll do like a quick coffee break. I think Charles is coming with a coffee, and we can make the break. And